Hidden behind curtains of silk and stone, the most powerful men in the world shared their most dangerous secrets with the least powerful people in the room. What happens when desire crosses the threshold of the throne? Tonight, we walk the quiet corridors of ancient palaces, through half-lit doorways and under the watchful gaze of carved lions. We will explore the forbidden desires of kings and the thin, fragile line their servants walk between service and catastrophe. This is not a tour of tawdry scandal. It is a study in power and intimacy, the way private once could ignite public crises, how a glance turned into a rumor, and how a whispered name could become a dynasty's undoing. We'll drift from the bas-reliefs of Assyria to the river palaces of Egypt, from Persian courts lacquered with gold to the painted villas of Rome, from the jade halls of Han China to the marble echo of Macedonian banquets. You will meet eunuchs and cupbearers, ladies-in-waiting and chamberlains, those who guarded the bedchamber, carried the keys, poured the wine, and sometimes paid the price for a monarch's desire. We'll tell a few famous stories and a few that survived only as delicate threads in ancient texts. And where the record grows murky, we'll tell you so. Some sources say, later writers embroidered, rumor became history. Because in the palace, facts were often born as whispers. Settle in, listen for the soft steps in the corridor. We begin at the threshold, where power slept. To understand forbidden desire in ancient courts, we have to begin with the choreography of the palace. Imagine the night watch. The air is cool, lamps float like small suns over painted walls, and the world is organized into circles. At the center lies the king, living symbol, lawgiver, and in many societies the body upon which cosmic order rests. Around him a ring of intimacy, the household. Another ring, administrators, guards, scribes. Then courtiers, nobles, foreign envoys, supplicants, the city, the fields. Between any outsider and the royal person lay gateways. Not just doors, but people. The cupbearer who tasted the wine first, the chamberlain who folded back the curtain, the eunuch who held the keys to the women's quarters, the head of the guards who controlled the night. These roles were practical and symbolic. Whoever could approach the king's body could touch the engine of the state. In many civilizations, the royal body was sacred, set apart. In Egypt, the king bore the burden of Ma'at, cosmic balance, and his bedroom was mapped as carefully as a ritual site. In Persia, according to Greek observers, the king ate in solitude, his meals controlled and observed, as if constant ritual wrapped his simple human needs. In China, the emperor's inner apartments were the hidden heart of the realm. Rules governed how many steps could be taken, how curtains might be opened, who could breathe the same air. And yet, for all this distance, servants lived in the king's weather. They woke with his schedule, learned his moods, brought his news. The palace had its own weather systems, breezes of favor and sudden squalls. Servants were barometers. If the king laughed at breakfast, the whole day might be brighter. If his brow tightened at the first cup of wine, the corridors grew hushed. Desire, in this world, was never just private. A king could desire many things: victory, glory, a new city, and sometimes someone. That someone might be the wrong someone, married to another, bound by ritual prohibition, out of reach by custom, or simply too far below in a world of ranks and belts and bows. Desire made kings human. It also tested the machinery built to protect them from their own appetites. Servants stood very close to this flame. Cupbearers felt its heat when a glance lingered too long over the rim of a goblet. Ladies-in-waiting heard it in the sighs between songs. Eunuchs managed it like fire watchers, cautious and exact, understanding that a single spark, placed carelessly, could set the tapestries burning. What counts as forbidden Depends on where you stand. In some courts, relations across certain lines of rank were outlawed or punished. In others, a king's preferences set the law in real time. But even where the king could not be punished, others could. That risk, a sudden exile, a drowning in rumors, a disappearance, fluttered like a moth in the candlelight of every court. We will step now into stories, not to tingle at scandal, but to understand how a private whisper becomes public fate. Close your eyes. Listen to the hinge creak. This door opens onto a tale that began with a look. From architecture to incident, we pass through the first story, a single glance that toppled a throne. Story 1. The King Who Wanted to Be Seen. Herodotus tells a tale, old by the time he wrote it, of Candace, king of Lydia, and Gyges, his bodyguard. Candace was proud, too proud of his wife's beauty. Gyges, he said, perhaps in a tone halfway between command and confession, you must see her. In the tale, the king hides his guard in the royal bedchamber to peer at the sleeping queen. A curtain, a sliver of lamplight, the whisper of linen. The queen sees a shadow move. She understands at once what has happened. Her body, the part of her that belonged to herself in a world that gave her little privacy, has been exhibited like a treasure. In the morning, she calls Gyges. She offers a choice. Kill the king who humiliated me, or die for your participation. It is a hard law, a private justice. Gyges chooses survival and kills Candace. He becomes king, and so begins a new dynasty. It reads like a parable. Desire as display destroys a king. A servant caught in the middle seizes the crown. Did it happen exactly like this? Herodotus loved such instructive stories, and some details may be embroidered by time. But the lesson is carved in stone. The moment a private desire breaks the ring of ritual and respect, the palace itself trembles. And the person closest to the act, in this case a bodyguard, bears the danger, the guilt, and the opportunity. Story 2. The Shawl of Xerxes. Take a few steps east, and 2 centuries later. Another Herodotian tale, Xerxes, king of kings, returns from his Greek wars to his palace and sees a woman he cannot have, either his brother Mazis' wife or, as some versions say, her daughter Artate. Desire tangles itself into kinship, into politics, into the fabric of a family. Xerxes gives the girl a magnificent robe, woven by his queen Amestris. The robe is not only beautiful, it is recognizable. It is the queen's work. When the robe appears on a different woman, the palace gasps. From this gift, revenge unfolds. Amestris punishes the wife she can reach, not the husband she cannot strike. In some sources, she orders mutilation. In others, exile and misery. We should read this carefully. Greek authors often depicted Persian queens and court life as exotic and cruel. But the pattern remains hauntingly clear. A king's private desire can become an instrument of public violence. Servants, the seamstress, the messenger, the maid who carries the robe, become unwilling accomplices, then vulnerable witnesses. Some sources say that eunuchs spread the news, others that a nurse gave the secret away. Whoever carried the story carried a death sentence. In such a world, even a robe could be a weapon, even a glance a trap. Story 3. The Kiss at Susa. Now to Alexander, luminous and exhausted at the height of his conquests. Among the many people who make up his court, there is a young Persian eunuch named Bagoas. He has survived the fall of one empire and the rise of another by learning the delicate, deadly dance of proximity. He pours wine, carries messages, and, some sources say, becomes Alexander's intimate companion. Plutarch and Curtius Rufus describe a moment. At a festival or a procession, the troops urge Alexander to kiss Bagoas. The king, amused or tender, were cognizant of the politics of pleasing both Persian and Macedonian audiences. Does so. What did this mean? The scene has been told and retold. Some see a gesture of syncretism, the conqueror honoring a Persian court tradition of favorites. Others see tenderness in a hard world. Some say it was theater, the kind of moment that makes posters for modern retellings. What is certain is that a servant stood at the very edge of power because he controlled access, conversation, and intimacy. He paid attention to danger in the king's breathing, the tilt of his head, the cadence of an order. He knew the room could change temperature in a heartbeat. Bagoa's story is often told as if it were simply romantic, but in the palace nothing is simple. Perhaps he found protection in Alexander's favor. Perhaps he earned enemies for the same reason. We do not hear his voice. We only glimpse him in reflections from writers who came later, each with their own agenda. We can, however, understand the structure. The servant closest to the king bore the greatest risks and rewards. Story 4. The Cut Sleeve. We cross the mountains to Han, China. An emperor named Ai wakes one afternoon with his lover, a young official named Dong Xian, asleep upon the emperor's sleeve. The emperor has matters of state to attend. He might pull his arm free and wake him. Instead, he takes a knife and cuts the sleeve at the seam, leaving a piece of silk behind so the other man can keep sleeping. The story is gentle. It is told as a story of love. Later, poets called certain fashion choices the cut sleeve style, a nod to this moment of patience and care. But even in gentleness, there is peril. Dong Xian's relatives rise in rank. Courtiers raise their eyebrows. The machinery of resentment begins to grind. When Emperor Ai dies, the tide recedes. Dong Xian is left exposed, and he perishes a victim of the new regime's cleanup. Here is another version of the same old song. The servant whose closeness grants power is often the first to drown when the current changes. Some sources say the story of the cut sleeve lasted longer than the reign precisely because it was tender, a rare moment of kindness in a genre too full of cruelty. It reminds us that not all forbidden desires were cruel. Some simply ran against the clockwork of hierarchy. There is room in our understanding for both. Story 5. Rome's Chamber. The Roman emperors inherited the household of a republic that became a court in all but name. They surrounded themselves with freedmen, former slaves who owed their status to imperial favor, and with chamber servants whose Latin titles sound like job descriptions but were really stations of intimate power. A cubicularius could run the emperor's bedroom as a chief of staff runs an office. A quiet word in the night might have shaped more decisions than a thunderous debate in the Senate. The darker side of Roman imperial household life is not shy in our sources. Suetonius revels in salacious anecdote. Tacitus writes with withering scorn. We should be careful. Many of these stories were written as moral lessons or political attacks. Still, the pattern holds. Intimacy could be a ladder or a trap. Freedmen like Narcissus and Pallas under Claudius managed correspondence, finances, and access. They were called servants, but for a time they were among the most powerful people in the world. When favor faded, they fell fast. One infamous case, uncomfortable and important to address, is Emperor Nero's treatment of a youth named Sporus, whom he allegedly had castrated and then married in a public ceremony. The story is mainly used by ancient authors to condemn Nero's cruelty and excess. It stands as a stark reminder. The palace could be a place not of romance, but of exploitation. When power desires without constraint, the vulnerable suffer first. Each of these vignettes asks the same question. How do human wants, messy, tender, selfish, impulsive, live inside a machine built to magnify them? In palaces, there were always people in the doorway, holding the curtain. They knew which silences mattered, which whispers were mortal, We've watched desire fold into power. Now, meet the people who managed it, the gatekeepers who held keys and sometimes destinies. They are everywhere in the sources, often unnamed. The eunuch who brought in those permitted to approach, the cupbearer in the fresco with a metal goblet, the hired nurse who soothed a royal child. They appear like shadows at the edge of the scene, and yet they anchored the story. Let's step closer. Eunuchs, in particular, occupied a paradoxical space in ancient courts from Assyria to Persia, from Han China to later Byzantium, because they were seen as incapable of founding a rival dynasty. They were promoted to positions of extraordinary trust. They managed harem doors, supervised palace women, and controlled schedules. They could carry letters into the rooms where no other men were permitted. In their hands lay the keys to a kingdom's private life. That trust could look like power. Often it was power. A eunuch could decide who got an audience and when. He could delay a petition a day longer, and that delay could become a crisis. He could suggest arrest when he sensed the monarch's temper. The best eunuchs were readers of air pressure, skilled in the art of diplomacy, fluent in the micro-language of the court. A lifted eyebrow here, a soft cough there. When a consort cried, they chose what words to bring. When a minister begged, they reported which phrases fell flat. The cupbearer's role seemed simple in name and profound in practice. He shared the risk of poison. He poured for the king and watched who else drank. In some cultures, he selected wines like a sommelier and planned the cadence of the feast because in many courts politics happened over dinner. A cupbearer tasted before the king, an act that put his own body between ruler and harm. If the king trusted him enough to drink what he poured, perhaps he was the single most trusted servant of the day. Ladies-in-waiting and bedchamber attendants, with a dozen local names, were also gatekeepers. They adjusted the queen's bracelets, managed the daily rhythms of the inner apartments, and said no to impatient noblemen. They knew the back hallways and the sounds that meant danger. A shout out of time, a laugh too loud, a rustle of too many sandals. There were the queen's eyes when she could not go everywhere, and her ears when everyone else spoke carefully. With proximity came peril. A eunuch who carried messages in an affair had to walk a wire. Too efficient, and he was complicit. Too slow, and he angered someone powerful. A cupbearer who lingered too long near a favored concubine could be accused by a jealous rival. A lady-in-waiting who stumbled into a scandal might find herself married off and sent away overnight, or worse. The palace economy paid in gifts, bracelets, rings, positions, and collected in fear. The Arthashastra, an ancient Indian treatise sometimes attributed to Kautilya, reads at points like a manual for this world. It treats the king's household as blueprint space, filled with rules and watchers. It advises the use of decoys and spies, including among entertainers and companions, to test loyalty. If this cold prose has a temperature, it is a cool one. It warns rulers to distrust the charm of the very people they rely upon most. Some sections are severe, but they tell us how seriously ancient states took the dangers of desire within the palace. In Persia, Greek authors like Ctesias and Herodotus paint the harem as a place of intrigue, with eunuchs as go-betweens. We should be skeptical of their more exotic claims. They wrote to entertain and instruct as much as to inform. Still, inscriptions and administrative tablets show how structured and how guarded royal households were. Lists record distributions of oil and cloth to palace women. Tablets note rations for the king's men, who include attendants and guards. The detailed accounting reminds us this was not merely scandal. It was logistics. In Han China, the palace was a city. Noisy by day, it hushed by night. The Tang law codes and earlier Han injunctions sought to regulate interactions between palace staff and the outside world. Some rules forbade the exchange of gifts. Others set punishments for guards who spoke too familiarly with palace women. The multiplicity of laws hints at the persistence of the problem. Human beings, placed in close proximity with power and beauty, will sometimes forge a path through rules. Law is a map, life a river. Ladies of the bedchamber were often born into service. Their mothers had served. They would train daughters to speak in whispers and walk silently carrying a tray of jade cups. They learned thousands of tiny skills. How to resew a torn hem with a stitch invisible in candlelight. How to pour tea without the faintest splash. How to wake a dozing ruler at the right breath between dreams. Their power was subtle. It lay in being necessary. For every famous story of a favorite who held the king's heart, there were dozens of quieter tales. A servant who remained loyal through the king's illness. A chamberlain who tried to divert a disaster by contriving a harmless distraction. A eunuch who whispered to a young monarch the cost of what he was about to do. These acts do not make scandalous histories. They do, however, make courts survivable. And so the gatekeepers kept watch. They threaded needles and crises. They whispered now and whispered not yet. They stood near the flame and hoped not to burn. We've met the keepers of keys. Now step back. Let's look at the rules, sacred and secular, that drew the line between permitted and forbidden. Every palace sat inside a larger world of rules. The rules were not only laws. They were also beliefs about how the universe worked, about purity, family, and the right ordering of things. It is here that desire becomes truly dangerous, because it meets not just a household code, but a cosmos. In Egypt, the king bore responsibility for ma'at, balance, justice, truth. This infused even the private spheres of palace life. A royal household was not merely a home. It was a symbolic center of order. Within this order, marriages were tools of politics and piety. While later Greek and Roman writers were fascinated by rumors of incest among pharaohs, the reality was nuanced and varied by period. Some New Kingdom and later royal marriages did involve close kin, but the practice was not a free-for-all. The point here is not salacious detail, but the way ritual purity and dynastic logic could override ordinary social rules. Meanwhile, relations that crossed status lines, especially those that endangered succession, could be deeply taboo because they threatened the machinery that maintained ma'at. In Persia, Zoroastrian ideas about purity and truth met imperial practicality. Some sources, particularly later ones, mention a practice called zwidoda, sometimes interpreted as sanctioned close-kin marriage among elites. The extent and nature of this practice is debated by scholars. What is less debated is the reverence for truth, asha, and the ritual dimensions of daily life. Within such a system, the royal household's order was itself a hymn to the cosmic order. A king's forbidden desire was dangerous not because desire is shameful, but because it might warp the symmetry that kept the world upright. In India, the Arthashastra reads desire as a strategic risk. The king's pleasures are treated like any other state function, subject to schedules, surveillance, even decoys to foil plots. The harem is a fortified zone, not primarily because of morality, but because enemies will exploit intimacy as a weakness. Desire becomes a point of entry for spies, for assassins, for rival factions. The text also warns the king against attachment to favorites, a human counsel dressed in hard prose. Affection could be a leak in the ship of state. In China, Confucian ethics wrapped the emperor in relations. Ruler/subject, father/son, husband/wife. Each relation had its ritual obligations. The emperor's sexual life, like his meals and his sleep, was woven into calendars and rites. If this sounds cold, picture instead the comfort of a rhythm. The emperor's visits to consorts scheduled not simply for desire, but for cosmic balance. Breaking that rhythm in private could be seen in public as a crack in ritual propriety. A ruler known to indulge improperly might invite not only moral criticism, but metaphysical concern. The universe itself might shake its head. In Greece and Rome, the moral landscape was different again. In Greek city-states, relations were shaped by norms of status, age, and citizen identity. Some practices, celebrated by elite tradition, such as mentorship relations that also took on a romantic or sexual dimension, today demand a frank and critical lens. Power differentials and age disparities can mean exploitation, even when the culture baptizes them as education or friendship. Athenian orators, when angry, could turn any rumor of such intimacy into a weapon. The line between permitted and forbidden was often drawn by context. Who, how, and to what political end? Rome's system codified some of these fears. The Lex Julia under Augustus took adultery out of the purely private realm and made it a public crime, punishable by exile. The law targeted not only the act, but the social chaos it could breed. An emperor's private behavior, of course, could hover above such laws in practice. But public perception mattered. For all of Suetonius's gossipy pages, we also hear the drumbeat of the Roman virtue machine. Self-control, gravitas, pietas. An emperor who was believed to lack these risked more than jokes. He risked conspiracies fed by indignation. Across these societies, the forbidden was not just about sex. It was about the hazards of mixing human hunger with cosmic order, or social order, or political order. It was about breaches that could be read as omens. If a king cannot rule his own heart, can he rule a city? If he breaks the carefully drawn boundaries of his household, what other boundaries might break? These questions hum beneath the surface of the old stories. And they lead to a more intimate question still. What did it feel like to live as a servant beneath such laws? To stand between desire and decree? To love, perhaps, in a house that used love as a chess piece? From rules to consequences, we walk back into corridors where a whisper could become a sentence. What happened to the people caught in the crossfire? Let us slow our step and listen. Somewhere, a sandal scuffs a tile. Somewhere, a tray rattles. Someone is nervous. Here is the human ledger. What it cost to stand too close to power when desire turned dangerous. For the favored servant, the cupbearer promoted to chamberlain, the eunuch who knows where the king will walk tomorrow, the lady in waiting praised for her tact. The early rewards were tangible. Gifts shimmered. Land grants appeared. Family members found themselves improved by a relative's proximity to radiance. This was how the palace supplemented wages, with honor and advantage. But the ledger had a second column. Favor breeds enemies. Jealousy has a long sword. The day you're the king's favorite is the day after which your house begins to be watched. Rivals count your allies. Historians often don't record how many letters of warning were sent to those favorites by friends too afraid to be seen. We can imagine those notes, rolled thin, handed in a dark hall. Watch your back. Consider again Dong Xian. The cut sleeve is remembered. The end is less romantic. After Emperor Ai's death, Dong Xian's ascent became a criminal fact in the eyes of the next power. Lands were removed, titles erased, and finally, a life removed. The fall was not inevitable. It was structural. When favor is your oxygen, you die quickly in a different atmosphere. Consider a Persian courtier. Blur him, for we have many such figures, often named only once. Perhaps he was instructed to fetch a girl for the king. Perhaps he did not wish to. Or perhaps he took a bribe to choose one over another. Perhaps he whispered against the queen and gained a friend. Perhaps, later, that friend fell. Some sources say that palace servants were buried alive with their secrets. Others say they simply vanished into quiet exile. In either case, the lesson would have been clear to those who remained. Closeness carries a price tag. In Egypt, a maid might find herself suddenly married to a soldier and sent upriver. In Greece, a servant who failed to protect his silence might be sold to a distant island or punished publicly to make a point about aristocratic restraint. In Rome, a chamberlain dismissed by a new emperor might face charges invented after the fact. Corruption, luxury, words that covered every sin. A favorite under one regime became a cautionary tale under the next. There are quieter costs, too, hidden in the daily rituals. A servant might learn to never lift their eyes beyond what was necessary, to never linger in a doorway, to memorize and then forget, to abandon friendships that could be misread, to keep their own hearts on a leash because desire flowed both ways in palaces. Servants were human. Sometimes they fell in love with a fellow servant, with a minor official, perhaps even with a royal. And they learned that the palace was a poor place to fall. Yet not every ending was bitter. Some favorites navigated the maze and retired with their gifts. Some eunuchs, faithful to a succession of rulers, died old and wealthy, remembered with inscriptions that praised their loyalty and skill. Some ladies of the bedchamber married well and became matriarchs, quietly powerful far from the rooms where they once moved like shadows. We should not turn every story into tragedy, but we should remember how few of these happier endings were recorded. The drama of catastrophe tends to get ink. We can return, briefly, to one of the earliest cautionary tales, Gyges and Candaules. Herodotus casts Gyges as both victim and perpetrator. He did not ask to see the queen, he did kill the king. The queen, too, is both outrage and agency. In this triangle, the palace's rules break on the rocks of human choice, and the result becomes a new dynasty. It is hard to find an outcome more dramatic or more telling. In the ancient world, desire did not only ruin evenings, it remade history. Some sources say a late-night laugh could cost a servant their life if a jealous rival explained it badly the next morning. Others say kings sometimes protected their favorites fiercely and punished any who dared to threaten their happiness. Both can be true in different halls in different years. The palace was not a single place, but 1,000 nights. We have crossed rooms and centuries. Before we part, let us gather these strands. What do these murmured stories teach us about power, about privacy, and about the human heart? Desire is simple. Court life is not. When the simple enters the complicated, it changes shape. In ancient palaces, the desire of kings, unusual only in its consequences, moved through layers of ritual, law, and logistics. It met the steady hands of servants who lived by anticipation, by trust, by a kind of engineered forgetfulness. It met the cold clarity of statecraft and the hot pulse of jealousy. The result was a world where secrets could be currency, where a robe could start a war, where tenderness could be remembered for 1,000 years, where cruelty could be recorded as a lesson to rulers yet unborn. From Lydia's shadowed doorway to Persia's shimmering robes, from the hushed chambers of Han to the marble halls of Rome, from the gentle cut sleeve to the dangerous public kiss, each story is a facet of the same gem. They show the price of intimacy near power. They warn rulers that even a god-king sleeps like a man, and remind servants that the hand which lifts a curtain can also sign a death warrant. What happened when forbidden desires stirred behind the throne? Sometimes nothing, a look cooled, a letter burned, a servant steered the king away with a joke. Sometimes everything, a dynasty fell, a queen was avenged, a favorite rose, and then disappeared into history's silence. Between those two poles lie thousands of nights we will never know, measured out in breath and candle smoke, by people whose names the chroniclers did not think to write. If this quiet walk through forbidden rooms stays with you, if a shadow at a doorway or the whisper of silk now carries a different weight, consider lingering with us for another journey. There are more doors to open, more corridors to explore. Subscribe for more of these nocturnal histories. And let's keep listening for what the past almost never says out loud.